This is Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work, responding to another Ask Prof. Wolff question from our Patreon community. This question comes from Jason Vargas, and he asks me to talk a little bit about failures in socialist systems, when they happened, where they happened, what their causes and consequences were. That's a fair question, and I wanted to respond. But before I do, let me make clear that it is a very badly discredited Cold War legacy to think that one economic system has got all the strengths and another one has got all the weaknesses, the successes on one side, the failures on the other. That's what folks in the United States tried to say for so many decades when comparing the United States to the Soviet Union, and likewise, but in reverse, what many spokesmen and women in the Soviet Union said about the same comparison. This is not enlightening, this is not useful, it's mostly a kind of childish debate that hardly deserves the name. Every reasonable person presumes, and rightly so, that we all have strengths and weaknesses. You and I, capitalism does, socialism does. We're not talking about simple-minded notions of virtue on one side and vice on the other. However comforting that is to extremists who don't think straight, it's not something that we ought to indulge or allow because it crowds out that kind of noise, reasonable debate. So socialism, like capitalism, has strengths and weaknesses. And this question from Jason Vargas wants me to talk about weaknesses, or if you like, failures, which I'm glad to do, as long as we keep a notion that these failures sit side by side with socialism's successes, just like capitalism's successes sit side by side with its failures. So what have been the failures of socialism? Well, the failures we can talk about are the ones we have some empirical record of. In other words, human beings have tried to institute, to set up, to construct socialist economies, socialist societies based on those economies. They did it in Russia, in China, in Cuba, in North Vietnam, and in other places. They did it in a different way in Scandinavia and most of the countries of Western Europe, and so on. And so we can assess, identify the failures and look at them when we take a look at those societies in terms of the socialism they established and its strengths and weaknesses. For me, by far, the most important weakness in the socialisms so far tried, and I use this word tried very advisedly, very much on purpose, because what we have now is barely a century of experiments in going beyond capitalism to one or another kind of socialism. It's really only about a century. Whether you look at Scandinavia or Russia or China, these are all socialist efforts, and the others as well, that are a century old at the oldest, many of them much less of a history than that. And as with all transitions, from ancient economies to the modern, from slavery to feudalism, from feudalism to capitalism, in all those transitions, there were early experiments. Some lasted a long time, some didn't last very long at all, on the basis of which new experiments were tried. Many of those failed, that is, their failures overwhelmed their successes until they got the right mix of institutions and policies and programs to make the system become the prevalent economic system in society. Capitalism, the same as it emerged, for example, from European feudalism. So when I talk about the failures, again, I'm talking about the failures of those early experiments. So back to the major one. These experiments changed the world in particular ways and didn't change it in particular ways. And their failure is both about what they did that they shouldn't have and what they didn't do that they should have. Let's start with what they did that they shouldn't have. They gave much too much power and authority to the government, to the state. They overdid it in terms of what the state is going to do. Their criticisms of capitalism, often very well taken, led them too quickly and too narrowly to thinking that what the private capitalist employer didn't do properly or well or ethically or honestly, the government could, should, and would do better. Sometimes that was true, sometimes it wasn't. And the concentration of power meant that if people with unscrupulous intentions got a hold of that state, oh boy, what they might do that had nothing whatever to do with what the ideas of socialists were about going better. So what socialism failed at was to limit the power of the state. It went too far. But what did socialism not do that it should have done? Answer: it didn't transform the workplace. It was so focused on the government coming in to regulate, to control, to offset the horrible things capitalism did, where it was dominant, that they thought the government would come in, and they didn't attend to the way in which you need, if you're going to have socialism, to transform the workplace. You know, where adults spend most of their lives, 5 days out of 7, the best hours of those 5 days, most adults are working. They're in the workplace, the enterprise, the factory, the office, the store. That needed to be transformed if you were going to achieve the goals of socialism: equality, solidarity, fraternity, possibility for individuals to grow and to build institutions for themselves, their families, their communities, and so on. What socialism advocates. To get that done and to limit the power of the state, you needed to transform the workplace so it would be where the mass of people had real economic power that the state could not overrule. They didn't transform the workplace. They didn't transform it from a hierarchical top-down system with a few people telling everyone what to do to a democratic community, what we call in this country a worker co-op. Socialism didn't transform, in general, with a few exceptions, this workplace, and so they didn't make the change there they should have, while they gave the state too much. That, for me, is the crucial failures that socialism is correcting now as it plans how to differ in the 21st century from what it did in the 19th and the 20th. This is Richard Wolff for Democracy at Work.